In this video here, I'm going to be taking you through my personal journey with reading and the 7 stages I've gone along the way to the final stages, which now allow me to read more than ever and remember everything I read. So if you want to learn how I do that, make sure you stay tuned. So if you're like me and you like learning new things, expanding your horizons, and just adding new skills to your toolbox, then you probably have read a countless number of books. But by reading countless number of books, you've probably forgotten the vast majority of things you have read. So I was in this position about a year ago, and it's not to worry if you're in this position now, as this is really what drove me to figure out what was the most optimal way I could go about reading books where I could even start to expand my speed of reading, but still retain everything that I've read in the past, so I could still use all that great knowledge and all that great wisdom I picked up from my past books, regardless if I've read them in the last 6 months, year, or year and a half, so that moving forward, I can carry all this knowledge on me as almost like a library. So regardless of what stage you're in, whether it's the 2nd stage, the 4th stage, or the 6th stage, I'm sure there's some things you can glean from this video here to implement into your own personal reading practice. So if you're new here, my name is Matthew. I'm a realtor in the GTA, and this is my channel where I share everything I've learned around real estate, finance, and personal development, helping empower you to make the best decisions possible. So if you're interested in that, make sure to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell to not miss out on any one of my future videos. Other than that, let's just jump on into the very first stage of my personal reading journey, which starts off with good intentions. So this is a stage I believe everyone starts out with first in their own personal reading journey, where you have the best intentions. So you go out to the bookstore, you buy a couple of books, you bring them home all excited to read, and then all they end up doing is sitting on your shelf collecting dust. Now this was me for the longest time, and what really helped me progress out of this stage here wasn't actually first focusing on reading books, but it was first focusing on reading articles. Because reading articles, there was way less friction for myself to actually pick up an article and read it. And what I found worked the best, and my commitment to myself, was I was going to read 3 articles with my morning coffee before I did anything else. Now what's great about articles was, 1, like I mentioned, there's way less commitment from reading a 2-minute article over a 200-page book, but 2, I was able to change the subject of the articles depending on what I was feeling on reading that day. What this allowed me to do is truly build up the daily habit of picking up something and reading on a consistent basis, which is the first key lesson I learned during this stage here. Now, one app that I didn't learn until much later on, but wish I knew while I was in this stage here, was this app called Instapaper. This is an app that allows you to bookmark and save articles to read at a later date, and then when you are ready to read them, you can highlight them, make notes, and even go ahead and speed read them at a different speed that's much faster than you would ever be able to read with just reading it on the typical format. Which brings me to the 2nd stage, which is the pondering stage. Now, in this stage here, it was really where I started to actually pick up those books that I picked up in stage 1, but never actually opened. And what was great about this stage was I was actually learning a lot more deeply into a certain skill, as books are allowed to just go more into detail about a particular topic than a 2-minute article. Now, unfortunately, while reading this stage here, I did read some amazing books. However, after about 30 days, I found I was forgetting the majority of what I was reading, except for maybe 2 or 3 core elements. And what I learned from just this stage here was I need to be actively engaged with the book that I was reading. And the easiest way to do that was just to read with a highlighter in my hand, and anything that I found insightful or a great quote or something that I wanted to remember, I'd pick up the highlighter and just highlight it and allow myself to have a visual cue, so if I was flipping through that book again, I could easily see which areas were the most important things when I was reading it the first time. Now also in this stage here, another thing that I learned was I was reading all these books with less of an intent to actually pick up a particular skill to apply. I was just more reading for the love of reading. And this is something I would highly recommend everyone start with first, is just love what you're reading until you fall in love with reading. And this here really allowed me to just fall in love with reading and get that passion for reading and understanding that, hey, this is a skill that you're going to use for your lifetime, so you might as well enjoy it. Now, unfortunately, the love of reading only goes so far, and that's great if you're reading fiction books. However, for non-fiction books, when you're reading, you want to read with a purpose, and the purpose isn't just to retain as much information as possible, but it's to retain that information and apply it to whatever you're working towards. So the second key lesson I learned in this stage here was, first, fall in love with reading, and after you do that, start reading with the intention to apply specific knowledge to the areas you're working in currently. And that brings me on to the stage 3, which is the doer. This was a pretty easy transition for me to this stage here, as I just had to start reading with a highlighter and ask myself at the beginning of each month, what is one skill I wanted to learn this month that I could go in and implement? Now, what I found was I was able to recall and retain a lot more information as actually actively engaged with the text and going ahead and implementing it. However, at the end of the day, you might get 10 great golden nuggets from a book, but you're only going to implement 1 or 2 of them. And therefore, you have another 8 that are just going to sit on the shelf waiting for you to pick up that book and look through and read it again. And this is really where I spent the majority or the half of my reading journey was on this stage here. And as the bookshelves grew and I'd read more and more books, what I found was there's a lot of difficulty and I was wasting a lot of time going, hey, I remember reading this, which book was it? And I'd thumb through 3 or 4 different books looking for the specific book, and then I'd find it and then I'd have to go through that book more. And overall, it was just taking up too much time and I wasn't really accessible, because at the end of the day, these highlights are great, but if you can't access the highlights and you can't actually go ahead and use them, there's not much use to them, as they're just going to sit on your bookshelf similar to the stage 2. So what my key lesson here was, I really learned I had to externalize everything that I was learning and not rely on my memory. Because at the end of the day, our brains are great for processing and problem solving, but they're not great for memory storage. So what I did was it really made me move on to the stage 4, which is the hustler stage. And this stage here is where I really started to sit down at the end of every book that I finished, and I would write a quick summary about what that book was about, as well as 5 to 10 different golden nuggets I took from it, as well as any action steps I would go ahead and do after it. Now, this really allowed me to really hone in and get as much as possible from the books I was reading, as now not only could I use and implement that knowledge that month, but I could also, 6 months down the road or a year down the road, I could go back and look at my notes quickly and be like, oh, chapter 5 is what I was looking for. And then I could either reread that chapter or look over my notes and get the gist and move forward there. Now, this stage was absolutely game-changing for me, and it's something that I found really helped me out and really started to allow me to build up this digital database, or what I refer to as my second brain, on Notion. And actually, if you go back and view my very first YouTube video on this channel here, I was in this stage where I was experimenting with a couple different ways to figure out what's the best way to remember the information. So my very first YouTube video was just me covering a couple golden nuggets of one of the books I had read recently. Now, unfortunately, this also came with a couple flaws, as at the end of the day, when you're manually implementing all the highlights you had from the book into a note-taking system, that can easily take 1 hour to 2 hours. But I also found, because it took so much of my time, I would have to end up just almost like word for word, or not word for word, but summarize quickly what I took from that book and implement it into my database. Now, that was great, but I know for a fact that copying and pasting the notes that you've learned isn't the best way to learn something, but the best way to learn something is to look it, read it, understand it, and then make it into your own notes. So what I learned from this stage here was, it's great that now I have a long-term mindset where I'm now actually collecting a database of my second brain, where I can look back on all the books that I've read, but it's way too time consuming as I get busier and busier in my life. And therefore, I need to figure out a streamlined system so it allows me to then automate my book notes. Which brings me on to my next stage, which is the strategic thinker stage. Now, this stage here was a much bigger leap, as before this stage, I always read on a paperback book where I would highlight that. However, in order to streamline it, you can't just automatically take your highlights from a paper book into a digital format. So I had to start reading in a digital format first. And what I found works best was just reading on my iPad and highlighting it using the Kindle book. Then there's this app that I now use that's Readwise, which is almost like the intermediary between my Kindle app and my database app Notion, so that any highlights that I make on any books that I read will automatically be pulled from the Kindle app and put into my Notion database. Now, this is great, as it completely eliminated all the time I was spending about just writing and copying down the highlights I was making for the books. But also, during this stage here, because now I was using a digital device, I started to listen to audiobooks while also reading the books. So what's great was, One, I was averaging between maybe 1 to 2 books a month reading. However, when I started listening to the audiobook while also reading the books, I could easily increase the amount of books I was reading to 3 to 4. So that was almost double the amount of books I was reading before in the same amount of time period. This just allowed me to acquire way more knowledge than I ever have before. And also, because the bottleneck was removed, I was able to make a lot more smarter notes and really strategically think about how I was going to implement the knowledge that I was acquiring from those books. Now, with that said, I was still running into a similar problem I was running into before, where I was making all these great highlights, but they were just sitting, instead of on an actual physical bookshelf, they were just sitting on a digital database waiting for me to actually go in and seek and look out. So the key lesson I really learned from this stage here was I needed to make my notes and my books that I was taking readily accessible, so that if I was making a financial decision, the finance books were right there. Or if I was making a marketing decision, all the marketing books and the knowledge I've learned was readily accessible. Which brings me on to the next stage, the personal marketer stage. And I call this the personal marketer stage, as every marketer's objective is to ensure that they stay top of mind with their customer. And for me, I wanted to make sure my books stayed top of mind with me in anything I was doing. So what was great about this stage here was, because all my database was on Notion, it's a very flexible platform where then I could create a personal finance page that I could link my database and pull only the finance books that I've read to be readily accessible on this finance page, which also has quick links to my personal tracker for my monthly expenses, but also just any bank account information I need, as well as any investment decisions that I wanted to ponder. So that anytime I was working on a financial mindset, I could easily have every book that I've read, regardless if it was this month, 6 months ago, or a year ago, I could easily pull up and see, oh, hey, this is what I was wondering with this question here. It's in these books. This really made it accessible for me to then acquire any knowledge I needed to at a moment's notice. Now, what was also great about Notion was then not only could I implement the knowledge into these specific pages, whether it was finance, marketing, or my YouTube, sales, etc., but I could also then link my tasks that I was getting, or the actionable steps I was getting, to my master task list. Because at the end of the day, I have my whole weekly planner on Notion as well. So therefore, if I finished reading a book and I had an actual task, I could just add that into my master task list. And then when I go ahead and plan my next week, my tasks from those books would just automatically be there, ready for me to implement when I'm ready to take that action. Now, this is the stage that I am really currently still on, and will probably progress beyond this stage, but this is where I am currently. And up to this point here, I've really focused on trying to read as many books as possible and just reduce the friction and bottleneck to ensuring that I get all this information and externalize it to a database where then I can access it at a later date. However, what I believe the next step on my personal reading journey isn't actually reading more books, but rather rereading books, which brings me to the final stage, which is the Pantheon. Because at the end of the day, what I do with my life is I look at people and I study people that are way more successful, have gotten way more books read, and just a lot wiser than I am, and see what wisdom I can glean from them. And one thing I've recently noticed is, while yes, they've read thousands upon thousands of books, they would prefer to read their top 100 books over and over again and glean new wisdoms from rereading it, or just resurface old gold nuggets that they may have picked up but forgotten. So this is the next step, I believe, on my personal reading journey. Now, I'm going to have to update you guys probably in a year's time with the next 9, 10, and 11 steps that I'm going to add to my reading journey that I'm not even aware of yet. So if you're interested in learning what my reading journey is in a year, make sure to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell to not miss out on any one of my future videos. And if you've enjoyed this video of my own personal reading journey and it's helped you progress your own personal reading journey, make sure to smash the like button, as it truly does help me out with the YouTube algorithm. And if you're interested in some of the books that are on my personal Pantheon list that I'm planning on rereading, you can find the video right here where I go over my top 5 books at the moment that I have read so far. Other than that, guys, I hope you have a great and successful week, and I'll talk with you next week.